This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Biodiversity, a term that might seem distant, but is impacting our lives extensively. From jungle to the frozen world, land to ocean, from plants to animals, deserts to grasslands, biodiversity represents the amazing variety of life on Earth. Destruction of natural habitats, environmental pollution, invasion by alien species, extreme weather. Human beings have never faced such an urgent threat from biodiversity loss. This year, people are closely watching the UN Biodiversity Conference in Kunming to see if the global community can galvanize efforts at all levels to build a better future. As one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth, what has China done to preserve biodiversity, and how will it contribute? Can China, the rising star, and the EU, the global pioneer, join hands to protect the health of the planet? Faced with the population growth and economic pressure, how can human beings balance development and nature? Join CGTN Dialogue and Euronews for a co-presented panel discussion that will try to answer these pressing questions.
As world leaders are convening virtually for what is likely to be one of the most important summits on biodiversity in a decade, the COP15, people are paying more attention to biodiversity, a crucial area of sustainability that is often overlooked. China, as one of the 17 recognized megadiverse countries in the world, has elevated biodiversity conservation to a national strategy. The European Union has also stepped up by placing a biodiversity strategy at the core of its flagship Green Deal. Today, CGTN is partnering with Europe's biggest news channel, Euronews, for a panel discussion on the urgent issue of how to protect, preserve, and restore biodiversity on our planet. This program is also part of CGTN's Global Arena series. I'm Xu Qinduo, and I will be hosting from CGTN in Beijing, China.
My name is Jeremy Wilkes, and I will be hosting from Euronews in Lyon, France. This is a unique international collaboration between our channels, a rare chance for you to hear voices from the East and the West as the world meets virtually this week for the first part of the UN Biodiversity Conference in Kunming in China. Let's introduce our guests.
Well, joining me today at the CGTN are Ma Juan, Director with the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, and Dr. Li Lian, Director of Global Policy and Advocacy at WWF International.
And here at Euronews, we are pleased to welcome Miriam Bumran, Head of the Political and Research Section on Ecology and Biodiversity at UNESCO in Paris, and Josef Satella, Professor of Ecology at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Germany and co-chair of the 2019 Global Assessment at IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services.
We'll start with Dr. Li Lian. I know that President Xi Jinping gave the keynote speech on biodiversity at the summit of COP15. You were there at the site listening to his speech. So what's your takeaway?
I think I have two biggest takeaways. One is President Xi Jinping talk about the managing the global biodiversity that China is seeking for acting in country, but also seeking global cooperation. That's one thing. Second, big takeaway is that he announced four areas of action in China, but one from China. But one significantly is he committed 1.5 billion RMB to establish a Kunming Biodiversity Fund also welcome other countries to join. I think the significance of his announcement is that the developing countries, the non-developed countries, like China is still in the developing country state, like per capita status, is taking action and is calling for action together. I think that is very significant.
Well, Ma Jun, China is one of the megadiverse in terms of biodiversity countries. It harbors nearly 10% of plant species and 14% of animal species on Earth. If you go back further away from, like in 2012, China mentioned this idea of ecological civilization. So Ma Jun, from your point of view, now President Xi is making more promises of building, national parks and more efforts against the climate change. What do you see China is putting its mission of achieving those targets into action?
China is working on this, and ecological civilization has again been highlighted in this biodiversity COP meeting, and this is the first time for any international gathering, a major gathering, with the theme of ecological civilization. I think President Xi again highlighted this in his speech. I think ecological civilization means to something to be a transcendence of industrial civilization, and China has upheld this eco-civilization as one of its fundamental social economic development principles, which by itself is an action to fulfill the mainstreaming the biodiversity. And when this idea had been written into Chinese constitution, and today, China has there has been some concrete measures taken in China, such as the logging ban of natural forest, returning farmland and forest to forest and grassland, and establishing national parks and water pollution control. And China have conducted that in a massive way. And then, of course, a 10-year fishing ban in the entire Yangtze River basin. All these are concrete measures, and through these measures, we have seen some of the trend of biodiversity losses being checked in many parts of China, and some of the flagship species gradually coming back, including the number of panda and Tibetan antelopes.
Joseph, I would like to come to you now. From a European perspective, we're hearing this good news of initiatives in China, but we also know that this conference in Kunming was actually delayed because of the coronavirus, and that pandemic broke out, we think, because of encroachment of mankind onto natural areas. Do you think that we've learnt lessons from what happened with COVID-19?
Well, I think the first step we did as a global community, we have been made aware of the importance of natural systems, which are more or less undisturbed, or let's say only slightly disturbed or used by man, as a basis for human well-being. That means for the prevention of this kind of epidemics and later pandemics. So I think the first step was really that it gets into people's mind, which is the case, at least also in many leaders of countries. I know it from Germany, I know it from the European Union, for example. But it's still quite some way to really, let's say, derive the consequences. So we are now, let's say, discussing in Beijing and also in the next year, I think, how to deal with nature. And I guess it is very important that we really preserve nature and to, let's say, have the high amount of natural areas and avoid destruction of forests, for example, in order to also take care of our own health. So it will still take a while in people's mind, but I think we are on the good way.
Okay, so it's kind of filtering through. Question for Miriam. We know we had this delay. Was there progress on the sidelines in terms of coming up with a good deal for biodiversity, or have we actually just been delaying things and not really getting to the decisions we need to get to?
Well, I will agree with Joseph that there is a an awareness, unprecedented awareness about our interdependence with nature and the ecosystems and biodiversity with that crisis. So it's important that that this focus remains the same until there is this agreement that is going to be signed in Kunming next year, but beyond, until we achieve the 2030 target that all the governments have committed to. And also we have learned, we have seen, we have observed, so it's a very good news what the president of China has announced, that the countries are able to work together and to mobilize massive amount of funds to fix the crisis. So there is a hope and an opportunity, and especially during this virtual summit, but until the agreement in Kunming next year, that the governments will really invest, but also implement their commitment. And that's the crucial lessons that we have to learn from the past. And from the Aichi targets, we need funds, we need commitment, political commitment, but we need also the resources to implement what the countries and us as citizens have committed to.
Mm-hmm. Well, Marjorie, if you look at the general picture, I have some figures here. The International Union for Conservation of Nature Red List of threatened species, they recently showed that 28% of the species they assessed face the threat of extinction. 79 species are extinct in the wild. More than 8,000 are critically endangered. Over 14,000 are endangered, and over 15,000 are vulnerable, and close to 8,000 are nearly threatened. How do you make of those numbers, Marjorie?
Yeah, those numbers are reflect the current situation, that despite all the efforts made by the international community, we haven't seen the turning point on biodiversity. Over the past 50 years, we have seen a massive development, enormous development of humanity. With the world population doubling and world economy grow exponentially. But in the meantime, according to the Living Planet report, we have seen a nearly 60%, around 60% of losses of the population of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and also, Joseph, I think, is coming from EBIS, and according to their statistics, 1 million. Out of 8 million species are actually facing the risk of extinction, and about half of them over the next few decades. So the situation is extremely serious. And in China, I mentioned about all the successes, but we also have very, very sad losses when the Yangtze River dolphin, the Baiji, was announced to be functionally extinct, to have gone extinct as a major freshwater mammal. This is just one of the hard lessons that we must learn, and it should serve as a wake-up call.
Some people would say every 50 to 100 million years there will be a massive extinction. 75 to 95% of the species were simply gone. And people say that could be part of the natural evolution or natural selection. And why should we, the human beings, somehow trying so hard to intervene that natural process?
Yes, life is including death, and we see also the different cycle of nature. So this is part that you have natural extinctions. But what is really new and alarming is that it's very accelerating process like never before. And the reports from the science, from IBES, from IPCC, have clearly demonstrated that it's human-induced. Like the terrestrial ecosystems are altered because of human activities, because of land use changes, because of agriculture, because of industry, because of transportation, because of climate change also. That is the recent events that we have observed, for example, in Europe with the fires and the floods. were proven to be induced by human activities and the way we live on Earth and we manage ecosystems. So this is what is important to understand, is that this time it's not like before. Humans are responsible for what is happening. And so if humans are responsible, humans can and shall fix it.
I'd like to put a question to Li Lin, which is about this move to have a crime of ecocide, because we have courts which try people for genocide, crimes against other humans. Should we try and really push that forward and have the carrot and stick approach? Because we've heard some good moves, establishing new national parks, investing in restoring ecosystems, but shouldn't we also have prosecutions for things which have gone just very badly wrong and where biodiversity has been damaged badly as well? What do you think?
So let me start with what is the biodiversity? What is the ecosystem we're in? It's actually including the genetic resource, genetic informations that are carried evolving as a human being, as all other species going on. It's including the wildlife, for animals and the plants. It's also including the ecosystems, the services that them forming together, supporting us. This is really fundamental for a whole human being, for all the other life on the earth to sustain, to thrive. There are cases where the damaging to nature has been taken to the court and get a really good benefit to the environment. There's one case outside of offshore of Australia where the oil company leaking the oil into the ocean, which is really damaging the coral reef that really sustain many other ocean species. So they were brought to court, and then the action was stopped, and then compensation was made to the people and to nature. I think, yes, when we see the crime against nature, they should be brought to court and then they should be prosecuted. That can set the precedency that others should not do the same. We have to really work with nature other than against nature.
Can I just weigh in, with Chinese perspective, public interest litigation has been upheld by the legislation. The new legislation in China, and environmental NGOs have been granted the status to file a lawsuit against, of course, the polluters, but also those who damage and destroy ecosystem. And in China, we have one major local NGO, the Friends of Nature, filed a very classic case against a hydropower company who tried to build a dam that will that threat to the biodiversity, to the habitat of a endangered species, the green peacock, and they have won this case, and the project has now been cancelled. Yeah.
Are we doing the same kind of thing in Europe, Joseph?
I think we have laws which are sometimes quite strict, so we have chances to persecute those destroying the environment. I think we are doing this already to some extent, and don't know how much is really kind of a good balance. But I guess as soon or as long as you have laws which, let's say, allow you to be punished for environmental crimes, it helps you also not to commit the crime, at least to, let's say, show that we as a community, as a society, as a European society, are taking care of this one. So I think it's good to have it. It's not the only solution, but it's one important component in the legal perspective.
On one hand, we see we are in a kind of a biodiversity crisis. We see species, millions of them could disappear, At the same time, we do see the protection of some of the animals. For example, giant panda, Asian elephants, the mangrove forests, they are well protected. In particular, the giant panda, for example, over the past 30 plus years, the Chinese government has made great efforts to recover. And then we see the wild population of giant panda has actually doubled, and the Chinese government has announced in July that they are not endangered animal anymore. So, are there any experiences we can share, from country to country in protecting the species?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's important to say that conservation works and that some of the protected area and the reserves that were established are really indeed working, and that again humans can help to reintroduce some species that were disappearing. I think about the example in a transboundary biosphere reserve between France and Germany, when there was the lynx that was reintroduced successfully, and they had some babies recently. Or the same story in Delta du Rhône biosphere reserve in south of France, where thanks to some researchers and scientists, they have established some artificial island for nesting of the pink flamingo. And now since 60 years, they are coming back and nesting, and it's not anymore endangered. So there are success stories. It's good to focus on some emblematic species, but the real now issue is that biodiversity is not something that is only, far away, exotic, or focusing on species. It's really about all this interaction that we've been talking about, interaction between the genetic diversity, interaction between this genetic diversity and the species that we are talking about, and this interaction between those species and the ecosystems, and then this ecosystem that we humans are able to manage, and through agriculture, through farming, through grazing. And this is all this interaction between all these different levels that makes the complexity of biodiversity, but the beauty of life, and why on Earth we are able, we as human species, to be able to live in interaction, in harmony, hopefully, with the other living species.
I like to add what Miriam said about, man relation with nature. Conservation is really critical across the world, across the species that we're working with. But most importantly, we all know the drivers of biodiversity loss are more of one of our humanity's actions, including the land use, including overexploration, climate change, invasive species. So we can protect as much we can, but if we are not transforming our living, consumption, production style and our financial style, the more encroaching, the more threat will be put on nature. So the biodiversity conservation will not really generate the results we'd like to see. Therefore, looking at our relationship with nature, we also need to look into back to our production consumption patterns, how we produce food, how we entertain ourselves, how we manage our supply chain. So all that together, we are able to really make sure the nature thrive, to survive us, to sustain us, to thrive. I think looking back, the drivers of biodiversity is critical. We see the conservation conservation awareness are growing, but I think it's still a long way to go to really looking into ourselves, looking into our production consumption pattern, to really go to transformative economic reform. That's really needed, but I see that is just starting. So we need to really working all together towards that.
A question for our guests here in Europe. I'm curious about what you think about the biodiversity strategy for 2030 from the European Union. We've got a list of kind of tools that they want to deploy to try and improve biodiversity, restoring rivers, reversing the decline of pollinators, reducing the use of pesticides, planting trees. Is that it really? Is that what we've got in the toolbox? Is that all we can do, Joseph?
Well, these are, let's say, some important components of what we could and should do. I guess the overall thing is, of course, the economic question, like Lilin has just pointed out. It's about the indirect drivers. So you have to look at our economy, how we run the whole system. And then, of course, we hope to see effects, which we then, for example, monitor. We look at pollinators as one indicator. We look at how they survive. I think the whole picture is a bit larger. So it's not only these tools, it's just these tools are, let's say, components with which or through which we're going to see how successful we are. But also these are tools which we use to, let's say, hopefully achieve progress, like in the restoration. So the decade of restoration is now proclaimed in the European Union. So we're trying to do lots in restoration, where I always say we have to be careful not to forget conservation in this context. So not to lose the things which are there already, just to restore things which are lost already. So that's quite important to have both, to have the balance. So for me, priority is conserving systems and then going into restoration.
Every individual has a role to play, but obviously governments and the countries have a bigger role to play. If you look at the record, unfortunately, it's far from being ideal. For example, the 20 Aichi conservation targets, made in Japan in 2010. If you look at the record of countries fulfilling those targets, basically they have failed nearly all of them. So Ma Jun, what are the reasons? Are those targets somehow unrealistic, impossible to realize?
I think a major part of that is because most of the countries have not quite actually put biodiversity protection as a priority. So we put all these targets, ambitious targets, on paper, but they're not supported by the from legislation to government policy, and then also the money, the investment has not come along with that. I think all this has a lot to do with the failure of to achieve the first main goals of the IHE target, that is to mainstream biodiversity, and that's a hard lesson. And then secondly, we haven't quite valued nature's contribution. Whenever there's a conflict between development and environmental protection, the environment got sidelined because we haven't recognized the tremendous contribution by nature to the economy and to the livelihood of the people. Even just from a human development perspective, we need to recognize that 75% of the food crops need biodiversity, for pollination. More than 75% of all the fresh water coming from the healthy forest, and half of the world's population depend on the nature for their livelihood. So I hope that the Aichi lessons could be taken in a serious way.
We hear a lot about this goal of 30 by 30, and you were talking a lot about goals there, and you hear about it in Europe, protecting basically 30% of land and water by 2030. We've had countries in Europe commit to it. The Americans are committing to it. Is that a good goal, and is it something we're going to get signed next year? Question to Joseph, what do you think?
Well, it's a convention, of course. Yet we agreed on something which is now the 30 by 30 goal. I think it's a good goal because it really helps to preserve quite a lot of, let's say, important biodiversity and ecosystems and their services and functions. I mean, when mainstreaming the entire ideas, it's a bit more tricky. Of course, if you take Germany as an example, we have this 30% goal as well. We're discussing right now, negotiating who will be the next government, so it's also playing a role here. And there, people first think about, let's say, 30% of the land which can't be used by people, which is not the case in our country, of course. It's about 30% of land, which are a bit like man and biosphere-like activities, let's put it like this, where you have, let's say, traditional land use systems, you have, let's say, more original primary systems, but mainly land use systems, which are kind of, let's say, not very intensive, but also not abundant, which creates this high diversity. And this is the part which should become part of these nature conservation areas, this 30%. It's a matter of communication. As long as you only talk about conservation, people often think about fenced things. It's still in the attitude. So that's something where we have to really bring across the message. What does it really mean? And this means different things in different countries. But I guess all across Europe, I think even globally, the 30% goal is a quite important one in order to make real progress towards the conservation of biodiversity and ecosystems.
I just continue on this. So 30% is not each country's 30%. It's a global goal. Therefore it's a global. So some countries have reached biodiversity more than 30%. We should protect more than 30%. That's the one thing. The question will be where and how to measure that, right?
Can I bring in Marjun, though? Who's going to police this? If you actually do this, you say you're going to protect 30% of the planet. Who's the police force for this? Who's going to make sure that it's actually going to happen? Because we know that that's a great problem. We're declaring parks and saying this is going to be protected, and then nobody's looking out for it.
Yeah, you're right, Jeremy. I think in different countries, the power of enforcement, the level of enforcement usually varied. But it's encouraging to see that in more recent years, environmental laws and regulations have been the enforcement has been vastly strengthened in China. Over the past few years, Chinese, not just as I mentioned, some of the NGOs can bring cases to the court, but also the central government in China have sent tens of thousands over the past several years to different regions to try to go through the inspection, identify not just the polluters and eco damages, but also those government officials who failed this their duties, and this accountability system is being built.
Well, Dr. Li Lim, China is adopting a strategy of ecological conservation red lines, and it has designated, as Ma Jun said, 25% of its area as red line area. I'm wondering, we previously talked about 30% in most developed countries as protected land. How are they different?
So when China designating the ecological conservation red line, the criteria looking at is really to conserve the endangered species, the critical ecosystem services, and also disaster prevention. So that's the 25 you have seen. What we are working with China through different channels to build in the carbon sequestration as a part of ecosystem services, which was missing at the beginning. So this is once it's including all those key elements, we could see ecological redlining has a few significance in there. The first one, so this is really the integrated spatial planning for as a country as a whole. I think if the world can adopt similar practices, that we could really manage what Ma Jun mentioned, when the species or pollution not going through the boundary, this kind of collective global movement, global management of spatial planning could really be meaningful for our work. Second, the ecological redlining is one way of conserving the critical ecosystems. But that's also not only, there are also other measures we need to conserve. I think in China, the strict conservation of ecological redlining is one part, but also there are biodiversity ecosystems in other lines, like for agricultural land, for urban land. Biodiversity are all in there. The conservation of them are all are there as well. So therefore, the 25% of ecological redlining doesn't mean only 25% areas are managed. I think it's much more than that.
Well, Miriam, in Europe, we have this Europe Biodiversity Observation Network that was launched to bridge the gap. I mean, people say, there's on one hand you have a lot of data, the other hand you have a policy making in terms of helping protect the biodiversity. So how is it working, using data to support policy making in that respect?
Well, it's essential that we have good data to be able to manage and to understand how the ecosystems are functioning and what are the consequences of human actions on the long term. So what is important is that there is, in example, in UNESCO sites, you have a scientific committee that is helping to provide information and the data. They are working in close cooperation with the coordinator and the manager of the World Heritage Site or the Geopark. And then they can talk to different governance scheme to make sure that the local communities are involved and they're also part of the decision making. And then there is a clear understanding of where we want to go, what are the objectives of management, what is it we want to achieve, exactly what Li Ling was saying at the scale of a territory like a biosphere reserve, that there is a platform for discussion and that the science and the local and indigenous knowledge is feeding into the management action and that everybody understands their role and the consequences on the management of the ecosystems or the site, and take decisions about what are the priority for conservation, which species, which ecosystem, what are the priority for sustainable use. What is important in your UNESCO perspective, and coming back to what has been said, is that it's time for reconciliation. We used to live in a world, maybe it has changed now with COVID-19, where you had science separated from local and indigenous knowledge. IBES has made the reconciliation. In the conceptual framework, you have the scientist point of view, but you also welcome indigenous and local point of view. This is essential in the way we're going to fix our issue. It's time for reconciliation also between urban and rural. We are not living in a separate world. We are living together. We have cases like in UK, close to Brighton, there is the Biosphere Reserve. You have a lot of tourists coming to Brighton, but there are also rural farming and community gardeners that are helping to make sure that you can live in big cities, but also support the farming and the agriculture and the people who are living there. So again, it's time for reconciliation. We cannot oppose conservation somewhere by some people without humans and sustainable use elsewhere.
Miriam, I'm wondering what are the lessons that you have? What are the lessons that you have for the world from the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, from the geoparks, from different projects that you've had? Are there key things that you've learned from that you'd like to see transferred elsewhere?
Yes, the first lesson is that there are human communities that are able to live without destroying. That we have some everywhere, in every ecosystems, from arid zones to coastal area, people have learned to deal with their environment, and they have lessons and they know how to develop, to thrive without destroying. We have, for example, in the World Heritage between Spain and France, Montperdu, we're able to transmit the knowledge about transhumance, unique since the Middle Ages. So there are practices that are very ancient, that are still working, and that preserve the ecosystems. We are also able to restore, like Joseph said, we have to stop destroying because we should stop restoring. But whatever we can restore in mangrove in Vietnam, or for example, in UK again, we have one site, North Pennines in the UK. And this is where you have a restoration of peatland. It's helping to absorb carbon. And just this restoration process is enabling that it's like the equivalent of not using 7,000 cars a year. So this is really important. So it works. We have success story about restoration of ecosystems. We have stories and people who are able to conserve. What we need to do now is to do that everywhere and not again have this idea that if the governments are committed to 30%, it means that the other 70% are going to be as business as usual. We cannot continue business as usual. We really have to transform the way we live together on Earth with the other living species, and that again, we associate farming, agriculture, energy, the business, like Lillian said, that they are also responsible and accountable for the conservation of biodiversity. Conservation of biodiversity is not only in protected area. We can conserve biodiversity even living in cities. We do have at UNESCO cities like Dublin, part of Dublin, the capital city, is part of a biosphere reserve. This is where people live. This is where people drink. This is where people are working. This is our planet. It should be like that everywhere.
Inspired by what you're saying, do we actually start to need to put an economic cost on this, though? Ecosystem services are talked about a lot, but do we need to kind of price it in? We know that's being discussed related to carbon emissions. I'm going to put this question to Joseph, actually.
Well, I would say it would be quite important no longer to externalize the cost you really have. So internalization means you put the cost inside the product. This means you have to, let's say, also pay for the environmental, let's say, damage you have caused by producing something. In the end, this would lead, in my case, to, or in my opinion, to conditions where, for example, organically grown food is much cheaper than a conventional one if you really account for all the costs. So this is something which has to be, let's say, integrated. On the other hand, you have also this discussion about, let's say, putting price tags on everything, which I think is a bit tricky, but it helps in the discussion, in mainstreaming the whole issue. So taking two examples, we have this pollination example globally. It depends on how you calculate. It's maybe 150 to 600 billion euros per year or dollars per year on the global scale, which is quite a massive amount, which is kind of approximation of how much value we take as granted from nature. Or if you take other figures, it's good to use them in a discussion. Taking the floods in Germany recently, the damage in these 2 or 3 valleys was 30 billion euros. So just to know this figure, so being preventive prevents spending all this money, which otherwise you can really save. So I think we need to use economic arguments, but we should not really fall in the pitfall of pricing each single species, for example. which, let's say, downgrades them to something which is tradable, which is not the case. So it's kind of balanced thing with the economics, but you need, let's say, the internalization of costs for the products we consume and we trade.
Mm-hmm. Well, Yusuf, I have a follow-up question, basically on countries, in terms of countries' participation in the global efforts on the biodiversity conservation. We have this, the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD. It described it as one of the single, the single most important international treaty on the biodiversity conservation. But the U.S., the biggest economy, is absent from this treaty, sort of like a Paris climate change deal during Trump. So how will the U.S. absence somehow impact on the global efforts of biodiversity conservation?
Well, that's really hard to answer, I would say. I think in terms of content, the US are quite along the same lines, because they have, for example, been partner in IPBES in the process. So they are part of IPBES. And the decisions or the documents you finalized in the end in Paris in 2019 was also agreed upon by the US delegation. So I guess they're not too far away, but it's a pity that they're not part of the legal enforcing units. But I'm still optimistic they are following a similar direction. Ideally, of course, would be great to bring them on board of CBD in the medium term as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, Marjun, now we have the Biden administration. Are we expecting something different? Just like the U.S. returned to the Paris Climate Change Accord, so the U.S. will join this CBD, this very important international treaty?
Of course, we all hope so, and we have recognized how during the Trump administration, the world have to wait, almost like wait for precious years to combat climate change, since the U.S. is the one of the largest emitter and as the largest economy, and so it can have the power to put the to undermine the global solidarity. So we do hope that with the President Biden coming back to Paris and Paris Agreement and now uphold a much more ambitious climate target, climate goals. We also hope that they could do more on the biodiversity side. Having said that, we also need to recognize that many of the American brands and companies are the front runners in trying to deal with climate, both climate and biodiversity losses. So I think there's still a broad, major opportunities for non-state collaboration to be achieved through the multi-stakeholder efforts.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know about you, about Chindu, but I'm excited about some of the ideas that have come forward here. This idea of being nature positive and how that can become a kind of buzzword towards the end of the century. What do you think?
Absolutely. In particular, I think there's a non-state factor, the business communities and also individuals with the increasing awareness of, you can do some contribution to the biodiversity conservation. That's a very important message.
Absolutely. Well, it's time to say goodbye. I'd like to thank all of our guests for such an insightful and engaging conversation. Thanks to Josef Satella from the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Germany and IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and Miriam Bumran from the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, known to everyone as UNESCO. Goodbye, au revoir, and auf Wiedersehen from Euronews in Lyon, France.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, Yusuf, and Mariam, and many thanks also to our guests, Marjun from the IPE and Dr. Lilin from WWF International. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Goodbye from Beijing, China. Thanks for watching.